Unplugged in, 2019 has come and gone. The new year brings with it a chance for new beginnings. But as we embark on 2020, we take a look back at a few of the top stories of 2019. Some issues remain unresolved. Pro-democracy protests, Cold War concerns. This as the United States enters a presidential election year that could have a global impact. Unplugged in, a look at 2020. Depending on who you ask, 2019 could be labeled as the year of the protest. Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Argentina, and that's just South America. Perhaps the most high-profile protests were in Hong Kong. They went on throughout 2019 and continue this day. The plugged-in team was there on the ground to see the protests firsthand.
There were protests everywhere. Tear gas.
Extradition bill.
Anti-government rally.
Violence in Hong Kong intensified overnight.
Vandalizing, and you can see the fire. You feel like a war zone. I was in Hong Kong from the end of August to the beginning of November, so about 2 months. There are casualties everywhere. I saw a female reporter was carried away. You can find the police being very easily agitated. They get angry right away because I know the protest was getting more and more violent.
點解會打爛呢個港鐵呢？因為呢個港鐵係成為咗警察嘅運兵車。
The Mongka station, it was all black. You can see the burn marks. The police asked the metro company, so the protesters have nowhere else to go. They enraged the protesters. They say they have the reason to vandalize a lot of stuff. I saw fire, I ran to the fire. I saw the black smoke came out so much. After the smoke disappeared, I saw the sign, Xiaomi store, which is a Chinese cell phone. I remember the China Bank, their ATM were all broken. The water was dripping down from the ceiling. The companies owned by the Chinese or supporting the Hong Kongese government, they'll be vandalized. I think there's also difficult for the Hong Kong police to be in that situation for such a long time. They are also very tired. They're being pushed to the limit. And I saw there were several older women were yelling at the police. And I saw the police. They don't know how to react to that. They would just have their hands holding in front of their body. I wouldn't say they're kids, but they look like pretty young. There are so many protests every day, every weekend. I don't see a lot of people in coordinating, but people are just coming out on their own. Also, office workers, they walk into the rally. It finished after the lunch hour and people just went back to work. It's all very organic. And people will do flash mobs. One of the most iconic protest songs on this movement is Glory to Hong Kong. So one time I went to this shopping center called City Plaza. There was this guy playing harmonica. When you turn around, you see it was like 3, 4, 5 stories of the shopping mall. It was full of people. We are all singing Glory to Hong Kong. Send chills to your spine. You will feel that. It's like emotion. The streets are not just for the police and the protesters. Regular Hong Kongese residents live there too. They come out to shop, they come out to eat. At that moment, I can realize how mentally a burden that would be to regular Hong Kong residents.
VOA senior White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara was part of the team in Hong Kong. She joins us with her thoughts on this ongoing story. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Greta.
You were in Hong Kong in the fall. What did you see?
So we were there in October, which was the weekend right after Carrie Lam's administration government enacted or tried to enact the face mask ban. So there were massive protests going on that weekend. And what I saw personally was just like the resilience and the determination of the people who were protesting. We spoke to quite a number of people, and every single time, I asked them, at that time, it has been going on for 4 months, what are you going to do? I mean, is this just your weekends now? And they said, yep, this is our weekend. We are going to protest, and we are going to keep the pressure, and we are not afraid of the government. That's basically the sense that we got.
Well, what sparked the protests originally was an extradition law in which someone would be extradited to China, and that sparked the protest. That law has now that's gone away. That law is not going to go into effect. So in spite of that, there are still these protests.
It was the extradition bill, and then the demands grew. And part of the demands have now included universal suffrage for the people of Hong Kong to be able to determine their own fate. But really what's happening is this is all leading up to 2047. What will happen to Hong Kong? How will Hong Kong look like in 2047 when there's the full handover to the government of China? And I think what the protests are doing is really trying to shape that narrative in order to be able to keep some of the freedoms that they've lived with since 97 when the handover happened. So what they're feeling right now is, even though the date is set for 2047, they feel that the Chinese government have already started encroaching on their rights.
Did you have a sense or feel that when you were there? How do you feel China in Hong Kong?
How do I feel China in Hong Kong? That's a hard question to answer in just the 5 days that I was there. But I did speak to people, and the people of Hong Kong is not a monolith. Some people do have sympathies to China. Some people feel that these protests are too violent. They feel that, why don't we just get along?
How popular is Carrie Lam?
Not very popular, we see from the recent district election, and certainly not popular among the protesters on the street. They see her as a puppet of Beijing. They see her as kowtowing to Beijing and not really representing the needs of the people of Hong Kong, right? I mean, there's been a couple of scares throughout the past 6 months where Beijing might send in the PLA, for example. I think it happened in August or September when they were just amassing Chinese soldiers on the border. So if that happens and a crackdown, then we'll be talking about a completely different story. But if the status quo continues, which is, the protesters keeping up pressure and then the Beijing government just tamping down once in a while, this kind of tussling of the two sides were both dug in and determined to continue, then it'll be more of the same. The situation is volatile and we don't know. It really depends on what steps Beijing will take in the future.
All right, you mentioned the United States. What is the U.S. current policy towards this?
So the Hong Kong Human Rights Bill have been passed by Congress. President Trump was very reluctant to sign it, but then he did.
And China didn't like that.
China did not like that. And when he announced that he was finally signing the bill, President Trump did say that he is doing this out of respect to President Xi and mindful that it is an issue that does not make the U.S. China trade negotiations any easier.
So he's trying to separate himself out with understandably so, with the trade from the political support for the Hong Kong.
Yes, and it's a very difficult situation for the president who wants to have a good deal with China in terms of trade, but also mindful of the fact that there's bipartisan support in Congress for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong.
Is there any indication at all, and I suspect the answer is no, that China would ever sort of relinquish Hong Kong?
I can't say that there's any indication.
No, I mean,
of that now.
I've never seen any either, but
Yeah.
you know, it seems to be Chinese, wanting its hold on Hong Kong.
Right, and they want to have Hong Kong to be something like Shanghai or Shenzhen, to be another economic power, but still living under Chinese law. And there's so many ways where the Chinese government can continue to pressure the people of Hong Kong, increase police surveillance, for example, making sure that pro-Beijing businesses fire people who protest. There's a lot of tactics that they can use.
It's beautiful, isn't it, Hong Kong?
It is a beautiful city.
Fascinating, rich culture,
and
rich
it's just
history.
so visually stunning. I mean, like all the hills and then the bay.
A lot of islands.
And I just found out when I was there, they have the most skyscrapers in the world, in the city.
I didn't know that.
There are thousands, literally 3,000 skyscrapers. And it's a beautiful city, 7 million people. It's an economic powerhouse. And now we're starting to hear recession is a threat in Hong Kong because of the sustained protests.
People are reluctant to do business if there are constant protests.
Right, because it's difficult to plan, it's difficult to invest. And now the protesters are also trying to figure out ways how to sustain this movement outside of the streets. And one of the ways that they're trying to do this is by boycotting, which we've seen happen as well.
Patsy, thank you very much. And of course, not just our eyes are on Hong Kong, but the world is watching.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Heading into 2020, there will be no shortage of stories when speaking of foreign policy. Will American voters re-elect President Donald Trump? Or will the United States have a new president? And what will be the global ripple effect? North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, they are all in play as the world's only superpower heads into an election year. Joining us to talk all things foreign policy is Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution. Thank you for joining us. How important is Ukraine to the United States strategically?
I don't think it's important enough that we should be risking a showdown with Russia to defend it. So I don't want it in NATO personally. And I've been opposed to the U.S. policy that aspires that someday it will be in NATO. In fact, I think we've gone just far enough to guarantee Ukraine is a target of Russian aggression. It's not our fault morally, but the incentives that we created by telling Vladimir Putin, someday we want to bring Ukraine into NATO, because President Bush said that in 2008. We just don't know when, and we're giving it no interim security guarantee along the way. That turned out to be a perverse set of incentives. But I think we do need to help Ukraine with its own internal governance and reform. And this Zelensky, the new president, may actually have some potential there.
But former comedian.
Yes.
What an interesting background.
And we should support him in trying to defuse the problems with Russia. He's not going to forgive Russia for their transgressions against his country. But if he can ratchet that down, it actually gives space for economic reform. Because one thing I'm sure of, Putin's not going to let Ukraine just go completely to the West. He will continue to sow unrest if this becomes a zero-sum game. So we're better off helping Ukraine stand on its own 2 feet and stand up for itself, but not force the issue of NATO expansion.
What do you think Putin's thinking these days about the geopolitics?
I think Putin feels like he's had a good decade, but that he doesn't really know his next step because he's got some major liabilities. The Russian economy is not doing great. Sanctions from Western countries have endured longer than he expected. He doesn't quite know how to wind down the Ukraine problem. He's like the dog that caught the car in Syria. I mean, yeah, his guy has won the war more or less, but now he's sort of stuck there with a few thousand troops. On balance, he's probably happy about that overall situation, but still, he's got to extricate at some point, doesn't have a lot of money for his Russian military that he's trying to build up in general. So life looks a lot better to him than Russia looked 10 or 20 years ago. But now he's got to figure out the next step in the remaining 5 years of his presidency. And it's not obvious where he goes. He's sort of cut Russia off from the world, and he's got bragging rights on a few small little places like Syria where he's gotten the better part of us. But what does that do for Russia's long-term prognosis or the improvement of its own real power, 10 and 20 years down the road? So I think he's at a major inflection point, and I would think he's got a little bit of self-doubt about where to go next.
How do you characterize our current policy with North Korea?
I think Kim Jong-un's trying to get Donald Trump's attention because I think he felt there was a year and a half of potentially productive diplomacy, but he's not getting what he wants out of it because people say, oh, these dictators, they just want to be seen with the American president, whoever that president might be. I don't think so. Kim Jong-un needs sanctions relief. His economy is being squeezed very hard, and he hoped that this outreach to Donald Trump could generate that. But to give Trump credit, he's been, I think, firm where he needed to be. And after the Hanoi summit last winter, he said, listen, what you're offering me by the way of slightly partial denuclearization is not enough to justify lifting of sanctions. And since that time, there's been no meaningful diplomacy.
it has been made plain to him, at least, unless the United States budges on the, giving up all the nuclear weapons, and he refuses to give up his nuclear weapon program. I mean, how in the world do we ever get? If both have a goal that's incompatible?
I think there's a natural compromise, but it is a compromise.
Which requires some level of, he's got to be reasonable.
Yeah, and what the compromise is, I believe, is something like this. Verifiably eliminate all of his ability to make more nuclear weapons.
So he can have what he has.
Let him keep what he has for the moment. Now, you don't enshrine that in some formal right for North Korea to be a permanent nuclear weapons state. You still keep U.S. sanctions until he hypothetically someday gives up the bombs he already has. But the UN sanctions are the ones he really needs to see lifted. Those are the ones that prevent trade with South Korea and China and Russia, the countries that he really needs to interact with. The sanctions that were applied in 16, 17, those are the ones he needs to see lifted.
China, are they very helpful in this? I know that they don't want 26 million people from DPRK, North Koreans, going over into China, but how helpful is China, and how helpful can China be?
I think they've been more good than bad, but it's sort of a 55-45 deal. A lot of sanctions evasion does occur, often with Chinese companies. The Chinese government may not suggest that or request it, but they clamp down intermittently and selectively. And so, they don't want North Korea to fail completely. They'd rather nurse it along, see a little bit of sanctions evasion so that the country doesn't completely collapse. And that's a little different from our goal. We'd be a little more willing to go to the brink over, the nuclear program being the ultimate concern. So China, I think, is a partial ally.
And we go to Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi, who is I think her title is counselor to the state or something similar to that, and the Rohingya. Here at VOA, we did a documentary called Displaced on the Rohingya. They're on the refugee camp in neighboring Bangladesh. Aung San Suu Kyi recently went to The Hague to defend Myanmar and their military and what they did to the Rohingya. What's your thought on what's going on with?
I think you're doing a great thing by keeping pressure and transparency. It's got to be making her feel awfully uncomfortable because she's trying to have it both ways, be the great human rights champion, but now the defender of the regime. She's probably got some theory of the case for how she's going to square this. But I think
she says the Rohingya are terrorists, and I always describe this a little bit like there were a number of Rohingya, militant Rohingya, maybe 30 or something, who went in and killed some military in Myanmar, some police. And then, of course, the Myanmar military reaction was to throw, 1 million out of the country and to commit genocide.
She has to know that's not an acceptable excuse for what's happened here. Now, she can probably get away with it because they have gotten away with it, at least in terms of physical facts on the ground. They've driven a lot of this population out. But it's important they not get away with it in the eyes of the world.
But right now, most of the sanctions, I think, have been lifted against Myanmar about 2012 or 2014. Do you see them being reimposed to try to put pressure on her, or is this going to continue?
It's a great question. I hope that at a minimum, countries and companies don't choose to invest a lot in Myanmar until there's been a certain price paid, a certain repentance period, and hopefully a return of some of the Rohingya. So if and when that happens, I hope private firms will take some responsibility here too and not just wait for governments to solve all the problems. Right now, Myanmar should be seen as tainted goods, and people should act accordingly.
For so long, for the last 8 or 9 months, when I've spoken to people in the current administration, they told me that Maduro in Venezuela is going to be out soon. He's going to be out soon. Well, he's not out. He's not out right now. And you mentioned Cuba. There's a Cuban influence in Venezuela. You've got the Venezuelans who are fleeing their own government and going into Colombia and on to other places, trying to find food and medicine. Where do we stand with Venezuela?
What you said. In other words, I think we have to learn in the United States government, and by the way, the intelligence community has often been wrong about this. Usually the CIA is pretty smart, but they've been wrong to expect that because countries get in economic trouble, their governments will fall. These regimes are really good at finding ways to stay in power. And even when they get protests, they usually just crush the demonstrators and find some other way to keep themselves afloat. They find an Iran or a Russia or somebody else to be at least a partial substitute for the money they used to get from somewhere else. They don't fail. So I think, I wasn't that strongly opposed to the sanctions, but given that they haven't worked and we seem to be losing ground, we may just have to concede that our effort has failed and actually loosen up a little bit on the sanctions enforcement in order to just let that country survive while we wait for a new political opportunity to come from some other direction.
2019 marked the return of the Ebola virus in Africa, the second worst outbreak ever. The World Health Organization says there are over 3,300 confirmed cases. More than 2,200 of those were fatal. Plugged In traveled with U.S. health officials in September to the epicenter of the outbreak. Mil Arcega reports from the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
It's a journey few Westerners will make. Over rainforests and active volcanoes, past the winding, dusty roads leading to the remote village of Butembo. Here, elbow bumps replace handshakes. Shoes and hands are disinfected. Anyone who enters, checked for fever. This is U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar's first visit to the Ebola Treatment Center in Butembo, the front line in the battle to stop the deadly virus.
It's an incredibly tragic situation, especially to see the children. So many children. I think that probably was one of the things that struck me the most, were how many kids are here. But I also came away with more hope than I thought I would.
The outbreak, which began in 2018, is now the second worst ever. Over 3,000 infected, more than 2,000 deaths. But there is hope for a permanent cure after the development of 2 new drugs synthesized from the blood of an Ebola-resistant patient.
You know, it's a game changer. I mean, it's a game changer.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is part of the team that helped develop the new drugs. Another is Dr. J.J. Muyembe, who told Plugged In Ebola is no longer a death sentence.
And I can confirm that Ebola is now a disease that we can treat. It is not linked to the death. So this message is very important for the population. So the population will trust and bring the patient to the treatment center.
But cultural mistrust is common here. Some believe Ebola is not a virus, but a man-made poison. The misguided perception of Ebola treatment centers in the past has been that sick people would walk into these centers and they would ultimately leave either in a body bag or in a coffin. But there's a lot of people in this community working hard to change that perception. Among them, Mulyanza Huguet. The young woman made a full recovery after receiving the experimental drug monoclonal antibody 114. Today, she goes from village to village, urging families to seek early treatment. Another serious challenge is security. More than 100 warring factions vie for dominance along the porous eastern borders of the Congo. In this part of the world, protecting health workers is a full-time job.
Thousands of security incidents, and anytime you have disruption in your intervention, of course the virus will replicate and you have to catch up. So it's taking a lot of energy and time.
The United States has already invested over $300 million to develop anti-Ebola vaccines and treatments. Secretary Azar hopes his visit demonstrates America's commitment to the region.
If it helps reinforce the fact that we were in this before the first Ebola case and we're going to be there after the last Ebola case, and it's a part of a community effort and community engagement, well then I'm delighted if it had any impact.
Plugged In's Mil Arcega joins us with more details on his trip to the DRC and what's being done to combat the Ebola virus. Mil, nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Mil, you went in September, and tell me about that trip.
Well, you know, that was a rather unexpected trip for me, actually, because I heard about it 5 days prior to leaving. They said, you're going on a trip to Africa. First time ever to that continent.
For Ebola, too, to boot.
For Ebola. The moment I told my wife I was going there to cover the Ebola outbreak, she had second thoughts about me leaving. But what a fascinating trip that was, and what an eye-opener for me. 2019 turns out to be a breakthrough year in terms of fighting Ebola. We went to the DRC at the height of the second worst outbreak of the Ebola virus. Some 3,300 people were infected. Quite a large mortality rate at the time, but it was a breakthrough because we traveled there about the same time that the United States, the National Institute of Health, was introducing 2 new drugs that would become a turning point in terms of treatment.
Tell me what you saw.
What I saw were, you know, as first of all, my first impressions of Africa, all I knew about Africa was what I'd heard on TV, what I'd seen in films. When I got there, yeah, certainly I saw that level of poverty that we've sort of seen in popular media. But what I also saw was a certain resilience, a certain kind of joie de vivre from the people who actually live there. The poorest folks living on the side of the streets, always with a ready smile for a strange face. So that was my first impression of Africa. Very friendly.
But in terms of the suffering, the biggest takeaway for me was we have discovered some treatments in 2019. Even a new vaccine was introduced as well in 2019. The problem that we have in that part of the world is security. You know, in the DRC, along the northeast edge, the border of that country, there are something like 100 warring factions, all vying for superiority there. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to stop people from being treated for Ebola. The more instability there is in the region, the greater their authority, the greater their control. So that was the biggest issue.
In some parts of the world, people don't trust medicine.
Yes.
And don't trust people coming who might not look like them in saying, I'm here to help you and here's the medicine. Did you find that in DRC or not? Were the people very receptive to help?
No, it's a vulnerability that's being exploited by many of the warring factions there, because there is a certain belief there that is quite prevalent that Ebola is not a virus. In fact, it is a poison. This is the myth that is being sort of thrown out there by some of these groups. You go to these treatment centers, it is a death sentence. You're going there to die. You're going to leave in a box. You don't go there for treatment. You go there to die. This is a Western experiment in how to subjugate the African people. That's sort of the mythology that is rising up. So what they need there really is education, because they have the tools for prevention. It's just getting the message across to people.
Now, you traveled with the Cabinet Secretary,
Alex Azar, yes.
HHS here. And was that his first trip, do you know, to the region? Or what was your impression of the United States and this Cabinet Secretary going there?
Well, prior to going there had been a lot of criticism that the United States was not pulling its weight in terms of controlling this disease. What I learned was the exact opposite. I may be at odds with some people in some of these countries, but the United States has really provided a lot of leadership, a lot of funding to get action on fighting Ebola. Alex Azar impressed me as someone who knew his stuff. I didn't realize he had a medical and drug prescription background. But he knew his stuff, and that's what really impressed me about him. It was his very first visit there, and all he wanted to do when he was there was to create these connections with these communities so they will trust the United States, and also emphasize to the rest of the world that this is an important battle. We are going to fight it. We're going to lead the way. We need your help.
Ebola is a terrible virus and just the worst.
It really is. I mean, it kills you from the inside, doesn't it?
It's just unthinkable how the people suffer, and I tip my hat to all those people who work in these treatment centers in Africa.
I do the same. I think if you look at the faces of some of the children who have been infected, I think, and you saw that in your previous visit to Africa in 2014. You see the heartbreak, especially with the parents, right? One of the things they're doing there at the Butembo Treatment Center is, you're always having to separate families, right? And that is a big issue in the
because it's so
culture.
easily transmitted. Is that?
It's so easily transmitted.
How do you transmit it? I mean, maybe
by contact.
Right. So, like, if I shake your hand and you have I have the virus on my hand and you shake my hand,
correct,
you might get it from my hand.
What's happened is it's changing cultures and norms in that region, right? Before you go to any of these areas that may be suspected of transmitting Ebola, you have your shoes washed. You have your temperature checked for fever.
In Liberia, one of the things that a lot of Doctors Without Borders and Samaritan's Purse were trying to do in the communities is it's a community, when they see you, they greet you, they hug you, and and now all of a sudden you're telling someone
changed.
Now just a fist bump or something.
No, you know what it is now?
What?
It's called the Ebola handshake is like this.
Like this?
That's the Ebola handshake. So you'll see this everywhere in the DRC and even along the borders of Rwanda and Uganda. When people see you, they go like this.
So what's the status now? You went there in September. Is there any update?
The latest update that I heard is while there has been progress in treatment and in vaccines, 27 new cases reported just in the month of December.
Is that a lot or is that down? I mean, I don't know what
it's
to make
actually
of that
down, and
it's still too many. I'm not
it's
suggesting.
It's still too many, but the chances of them recovering and being treated is much greater than it used to be.
That's all the time we have for today. 2019 has come and gone. It's been an eventful year with news that brought us both joy and heartbreak. But 2020 is here, and with that comes a chance for a fresh start. For world leaders and for everyday folks like the rest of us, a chance for a more peaceful world and a chance to pay more attention to our environment. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being plugged in, and Happy New Year, everyone.